Hello. Today we conclude our week-long deep dive into the book of Ruth, a narrative story, true story, that took us from a bleak setting deeper into a complicated plot and then toward the resolution. I'm going to read for us now the concluding verses of chapter 4, starting at verse 13, which ties this story up for us in a neat bow. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who's better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. Well, could this ending be better? In one sentence in verse 13, we see the rapid wrap-up of all that we'd hoped for. Ruth and Boaz marry, and she gives birth to a son. And in addition to that, we see in verse 17, this son, Obed, secures the line of God's people because it produces in just 2 generations King David. A significant figure, of course, along the way toward God's redemption plan. But before we explore the significance of this story and the conclusion, I want to offer a caution in thinking of this as a neat resolution, as I said earlier. There's a problem, you see, with seeing this ending as wrapping things up into a neat little bow. First, none of the story is as neat as the impression the 4-chapter overview really gives us. Naomi and Elimelech had fled famine. How bad must the situation have been for them to move out of the land of promise? And for 10 years they lived away. And though there was marriage for their 2 sons, there were no offspring in that time. And all 3 men, as we know, died, and their future outlook, as we talked about all week, was very bleak. Yes, Ruth marries and bears a son to Boaz, and he's nice, but Ruth didn't choose him out of love. This was a culturally appropriate solution that fortunately was reasonably positive. But it is pretty far from the conditions for marriage that we would advocate for today. It's hardly a neat story with a neat bow. And secondly, we don't want to stay on the surface of this story. It isn't trying to idealise marriage and babies, though these are the circumstances of this story and make sense of the cultural context. They aren't in and of themselves the neat bow we should be seeing. The micro details in this story are far more substantive. Naomi's love for Ruth is heartfelt and affectionate. She adopts Ruth into her family such that when Ruth has a baby with Boaz, did you notice women in the community say, "Naomi has a son"? And Ruth, who had every right and reason to leave Naomi and search for safety and comfort in her hometown with her own blood relatives and local gods, instead chooses to return Naomi's love with loyalty and kindness. She sacrifices what is hers and dedicates herself to Naomi and to Yahweh. They were exceptional verses in chapter 1, weren't they? Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And Boaz, he protected Ruth when she was vulnerable in his field. He didn't take advantage of or exploit her, though her circumstances left her open to that. Instead, he thanks her for asking him to enact his ability to be her guardian redeemer. He is gentle and wise and does everything he can to secure her good. These are the details we gain from the micro, intense, intimate short story of Ruth. And let's not miss how this micro family story with only 3 main characters is deeply connected to the macro, big picture story of the Bible. You see, the story of these 3 in the conclusion of our text today is purposefully tied to the genealogy outlined in verse 18 through to 22. It is not just for family posterity that these details are included, but to explicitly show that all that God did amongst and through these faithful characters wove together toward the arrival of King David. Sacrifice, redeeming generous love, inclusion of and affectionate embracing of the outsider, wove together to produce King David. These traits we see highlighted in the lives of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz are actually the traits of God's love, essentially tied into the bringing about of King David and, of course, eventually Jesus himself, as we saw on day 1. These 2 perspectives, the micro and the macro, always work together in the Bible to tell us about God's love. The micro personal stories like Ruth remind us that no one is missed. In the billions of people who have made up the human race, not one is missed. Yes, we belong to a big story, but we are not nameless widgets used for God's purposes. The micro moments remind us of God's deeply personal and intimate love for each one in the crowd that make up humanity across time. Ruth gives us that reminder. God showed concern and love and provision for these 2 vulnerable women. But the macro reminds us that we belong to a big story, one with a purpose and a resolution. This is a helpful perspective which puts into its right place issues with suffering and also brings into sharp focus where the reality of our hope ultimately lies. The neat bow is actually perfectly tied up when we take in the landscape of the entire Bible. Jesus is our guardian redeemer. We are outsiders, adopted and embraced lovingly into God's family. We are loved sacrificially and fully redeemed. And the end of our story has been told. Jesus defeated sin and death and rules with authority and power even today. And he will return to renew this world and restore all things to its created order. Do you ever wonder why we all seem so drawn to and taken by a good story? It's not because we are so easily entertained, but because in the most important, true, and profound way, we belong to the real story of God's love. Our setting and orientation belong in the garden, created for good and peace and harmony. And though sin and death has fractured that experience, a serious complication, Jesus, his Son, has come into this world to take on our likeness that he could secure our redemption by dying on a cross. Solution. And we have been given a perfect vision of our eternal future in the words of Revelation, assured because of Jesus' resurrection. Resolution. That's God's big story. And in the midst of that macro real story is your personal life, your personal story. God sees you and cares about you. He loves you and is as intimately acquainted with your life as he is with Naomi, Ruth and Boaz. This is what the book of Ruth idealizes for us. God's perfect love that impacts our own short story, but places us within the big picture of his redeeming love for all of humanity. I hope this encourages you as deeply as it has encouraged me. Take some time to reflect on this over the weekend, and I pray that as you do so, it renews your faith and joy. It's been a wonderful week, and I look forward to joining you again sometime soon. Bye for now.